Welcome into Fantasy Baseball today on Saturday, March 23rd, our final mailbag of the offseason. I am Frank Stampfl, joined by Scott White and Chris Towers. Today on the show, we have another prospect spotlight. We'll answer your mailbag questions, and we will be joined by a special guest later on in the podcast. I did want to give a sincere thank you to everybody who sent in questions this offseason, whether via email or an Apple Podcast review. I wish we could get to all of them. There's so many, but nonetheless, we do thank you. Let's get things started with a prospect spotlight. It's time to discuss some of the prospects who are catching our eye from a fantasy perspective, thanks to our sponsors at Hyundai, where they're thinking about every step of your journey out on the road. Today, we're talking about Chase DeLauter, outfield prospect with the Cleveland Guardians. He's Scott's number 31 prospect in his top 100. DeLauter is 22 years old, was a first-round pick back in 2022. Limited to just 57 games in the minors last year due to a fractured toe, but has flashed power, speed, and really good plate discipline. He was out at the Arizona Fall League where he continued to dominate, hit .299, 5 homers, 5 steals, more walks than strikeouts, 14-11. I got to see him while I was out there, just had complete control over the strike zone, advanced feel at the plate. And then he shows up to spring where he's just carried that over. He's 13 for 25, 4 home runs at the time of recording this. Scott, Chase DeLauter has not been sent down yet. He's also not on the Guardians 40-man roster. So what is the upside here, and when do you think we see DeLauter with the Guardians?
Well, I wouldn't have imagined we'd see him for the start of the season, and I still don't think we do. But the fact he's stuck around while others who we thought had a better chance, like Kyle Manzardo, have already been sent down, I think that's telling about how close the Guardians think Chase DeLauter is. And I think the spring is the spring for Chase DeLauter may have been more significant than the spring for any other prospect, because we've always had to assess him with tiny samples because he's been hurt so much since the Guardians took him 16th overall in 2022. He's played a total of 57 minor league games, only 6 of them above A-ball. But every time he's been healthy enough to take the field, the numbers have just been bonkers. 355 batting average in the minors. You mentioned the Arizona Fall League stats, and the fact he's batting .520 this spring with the 4 home runs, more walks than strikeouts again. I mean, this guy, he looks like just like a hitting savant. He looks like I may have been too low, ranking him 31st among my top 100 prospects, because he, we don't have like a lot of StatCast data for him since he hasn't spent any time at AAA yet, but he looks like a high impact bat, Chase DeLauter does, who is going to be ready to contribute sooner than later.
Chris, if we found out that DeLauter was on the opening day roster for the Guardians, how high do you think he would be drafted? Do you think he would go ahead of late round sleeper types like a Sal Frelick or a Parker Meadows? Those are also, I guess post hype-ish prospects that, we view as late round sleepers. What do you think about the cost if he were on the opening day roster?
I think it would probably settle in around 200 overall. He's not, there hasn't been a long runway for hype to build for him. He hasn't really, despite having a great spring, hasn't really been talked about a ton in fantasy circles. So I don't think the price would get exorbitant to the point where I'd be out on him. I think he'd probably be, Frelick and those guys, that makes sense. I think I'd take him above those guys just because there's an air of mystery to him. The thing that I would say about his chances is I was looking through MLBPlayingTime.com's spring training lineups, and on Tuesday, the Guardians had a split squad game. And it sure looked like one of those lineups was an opening day lineup. It was I clicked on the wrong one. Sorry. Steven Kwan, Jose Ramirez, Josh Naylor, Ramon Laureano batting cleanup. Andres Jimenez, Bo Naylor, Miles Straw, Brian Rocchio, Davison De Los Santos, I believe is how you pronounce his name. So Chase DeLauter was on the other side of that with Estevan Florial and Austin Hedges and other guys who we probably don't think are going to play every day. So based on that, and that's a one time sample size, so I don't want to say anything definitive there, but I wouldn't think he's going to make the opening day roster. But the fact that he hasn't been sent down means they're giving him as many looks as they can. And, he played a lot in the Arizona Fall League, had more walks and strikeouts there. He's got 19 walks to 15 strikeouts in 36 games dating back to the Arizona Fall League, including spring. So there's some really impressive stuff there. He's starting to tap into what scouts have long believed has been, plus raw power. 9 home runs in those 36 games between spring and Arizona Fall League after only 5 in 57 games last year. So I think there's a lot to like. He looks really good. I don't think he'll be on the opening day roster. I do not think it'll be long until we see him, though. It's certainly well before summer.
He was on, I had an article came out earlier this week, the top 12 prospects to stash. Not that every league is deep enough that you need to be stashing prospects, but Chase DeLauter was among those 12 for sure.
Do you, off the top of your head, Scott, remember where you had him ranked on that list? I was trying to pull
probably
it up.
Lower than I wish I probably, if I could rewrite it today, I'd probably move him up some. Maybe I'll have moved him up some by the time you listen to this.
Okay, so I'm just scrolling through. You have Chase DeLauter 10th on the list. And yeah, I think there could be an argument for him to be, I don't know, maybe 5th around like Jason Dominguez or Jordan Lawler. So
yeah, I could see that.
In the, him and there's another guy, Brooks Lee, who was 12th, who also has not been sent down by the Twins yet. Don't think either of them are going to be on the opening day roster, but the way they're being used and the way they're being talked about, I think both Brooks Lee and Chase DeLauter are going to be up pretty soon.
All right. Again, that is Chase DeLauter, outfield prospect with the Cleveland Guardians. Thanks again to Hyundai for sponsoring this segment and the show. Learn more at HyundaiUSA.com. And remember, if you want to hear about a specific top prospect on a future mailbag, just kidding, because there won't be any more future mailbags, but you could send them in and we could potentially talk about them on a regular season, in-season podcast. Just leave us a 5-star rating on Apple and drop the prospect's name in the review. Quickly promote a few things. Join our FBT Facebook group if you haven't already. Facebook.com/groups/fantasy-baseball today. You can hop in, ask any type of fantasy baseball question that you have. Waiver wire, trade, dynasty keeper, whatever it might be. Again, that's Facebook.com/groups/fantasy-baseball today. And download our 5-minute podcast, Fantasy Baseball Today in 5, wherever you listen to this podcast. Let's get into our mailbag questions. And first up, Apple Podcast reviews. This one's from Roto Ant. Dear Nate, Matthew, and Stefania.
That's a different podcast. Different sport as far as I know.
Is that a fantasy?
Yeah, I think that's like old fantasy focus podcast.
I think so. I have an upcoming draft for my home league that's 6x6 head-to-head categories with quality starts instead of wins and holds. Add holds and OPS. What players come to mind as the biggest risers in OPS and quality starts? So I made a list. I'll read some of these names off. If anything else comes to mind, feel free to add to it. But OPS risers up at the top: Aaron Judge, Juan Soto, Ohtani, Matt Olson, Yordan Alvarez, Kyle Schwarber, Christian Walker, Tristan Casas, Max Muncy, Marcell Ozuna, Rhys Hoskins, Nolan Gorman, Jorge Soler, James Outman, and Jack Sawinski. I think there's a very clear type there. It's walks a lot, gets on base, hits for good power. So obviously those names make a ton of sense.
The correlation between the players, the batters who gain value in OPS leagues is, and the ones who gain value in OBP leagues, OBP versus batting average, I think would be that would be a strong correlation. It's another format where the Bobby Witts of the world lose value just because so much of OPS comes from OBP.
I will say, I think having average and OPS is kind of a nice balance between just getting rid of batting average, because I think there's something to be said for trying to figure out who's going to hit for a good average and how to value those guys. And, OPS obviously takes into account on base percentage. It also takes into account slugging. So it's not just, valuing guys who get on base. So I think I like that. I like going to a 6x6 with OPS in theory, at least.
Blasphemy, Chris. That is blasphemic of you.
Quality starts leaders from last year: Logan Webb had 24, Zach Wheeler and Chris Bassett each had 21, and then each of these names had 20 quality starts exactly. Jordan Montgomery, Framber Valdez, George Kirby, Pablo Lopez, Justin Steele, Kevin Gosman, Blake Snell, and Zach Gallen. A few later names going deeper in drafts that had at least 15 quality starts last year. Seth Lugo, Brian Bayo, and Marcus Stroman. Anybody else come to mind? Or is that a good enough list?
Good pitchers tend to get quality starts. Good pitchers. There are going to be exceptions, like younger guys are going to be less likely to get quality starts just because they're less likely to pitch deep into games. But yeah, I think for the most part, it shouldn't really change the way you approach things. I guess you're maybe a little like, I don't know, even like Max Fried should get a bunch of quality starts as long as he's healthy. I was going to say it's like it maybe downgrades some of the guys on really good teams who are going to get a lot of wins, but like you got to pitch at least 5 innings to qualify for a win. So most of the guys who are going to get that are probably going to be pretty good and also get a decent amount of quality starts. So I don't think it really changes the way you value pitchers very much.
All right, let's move on to the next question. This one's from John Thundergun. What a name.
All right.
I'm in a 6x5 OPS Roto Keeper League. There you go, Chris. Another batting average in OPS, it looks like.
Yeah.
Keep 4 at the round before last year's draft cost and can keep as long as you want until the draft cost gets to the 5th round. Top 5 picks can't be kept. I'm definitely keeping Kyle Tucker in the 10th, Julio Rodriguez in the 14th, and Shohei Ohtani, the hitter, in the 15th. Would you go with Elly De La Cruz in the 16th or Corbin Burns in the 13th as my last keeper? Leaning Elly to factor in the ability to keep for many more years.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think Elly De La Cruz. Look, I mean, you can keep Corbin Burns for a long time, too, in round 13. So it's not like that's a bad choice. But Elly De La Cruz, I think it won't be many years before he's in the first round discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I do have Burns ranked ahead this year, and the difference between a 13th and a 16th round pick is pretty negligible. So,
but you're retaining the value for many years.
Right?
Come.
Yeah,
that's what makes it. That's the distinction for me.
Does the fact that he already has 3 amazing hitter keepers factor in at all?
Not really. Not for me. Given that you're thinking many years ahead, and look, there's always a chance like the league folds and you don't get the full payoff.
That's always,
but if
that's
it's a stable league, like that's not something I ever really worry about because I play with people who like to play, and I've never had a league just up and end. But if that's something that happens with you a lot, maybe I'd consider selling out for the short term. But
so
I'd rather be set up for the long term.
Here's my question. Who do you think provides more value over the next 3 years? Elly De La Cruz or Corbin Burns?
Elly De La Cruz.
Probably Elly.
I think that's probably right, just because any pitcher can get hurt much more easily than a hitter, certainly. So, yeah, I think that's probably right. But I don't know. You've got such a good start that I feel like prioritizing right now might make more sense. But I get it. It's fine. It's fine. Keep Elly.
All right, let's take our first break. When we return, we get to your emails here on Fantasy Baseball Today.
The best couch potatoes come from Pluto TV country.
And these taters, they like all sorts of different things.
Survivor Channel, Ink Master Channel.
If it's got a spaceship in it, I'm probably watching it.
3 channels dedicated to CSI.
Whatever mood you're in, it's going to be easy watching.
Welcome back in. Let's continue on with your mailbag questions. This time, emails, fantasybaseball@cbsi.com. And this one is from Frank. Not me, I swear. 5x5 Roto, a very deep league, 14 teams, 35 players on each team. Waivers are very thin. I have pretty solid starting pitching, and my relievers are Carlos Estevez, Raisel Iglesias, Mason Miller, and Tyler Kinley. I was offered Walker Buehler for Mason Miller. I really like the chance to have Buehler, but given that all my relievers besides Iglesias aren't a shoo-in for saves, is giving up Miller too hurtful? I do think Estevez is probably a shoo-in, at least early on.
I mean, he's a shoo-in for a couple of saves. After that, I can't say anything. I mean, he's a shoo-in for as many saves as he can get before he implodes and Robert Stevenson gets back.
Fair.
I'd rather have Walker Buehler.
Wow, and you're the Mason Miller guy.
Yeah, I mean, I like Mason Miller, but
in those deep leagues, the cost gets elevated so much and it's a bloody battle to pick up the ones that emerge on the waiver wire. So you're kind of stuck with whatever you draft, not literally, but practically. So I understand the hesitation here. I mean, in a vacuum, I'd prefer Buehler over Mason Miller. And like if it was a typical 12-team league, I wouldn't hesitate to make that deal because I know saves are going to be attainable later. But I'm not confident they will be attainable later in this league. And you have to balance the categories. So I'm leaning against it. If Walker Buehler was a surer thing, like if he wasn't coming back from his second Tommy John and didn't have performance issues before having that second Tommy John, I'd be a little more eager to do it. I'm kind of with Frank, the emailer here, not Frank Stampfl, but Frank, the emailer. And that I don't know that I want to do it.
Well, you know what, Scott? I am not with Scott White, the analyst, either, because I think Mason Miller probably has as much injury risk as Walker Buehler, even though Walker Buehler is pretty hurt.
That's not why
Walker Buehler. It's worth pointing out. Walker Buehler is not currently hurt. Walker Buehler is currently 100% healthy. It's not a Yuri Perez situation. Like Walker Buehler is 100% healthy and has been for months.
I didn't know the argument was even about health. I just thought it was, am I crippling my team in one of 10 necessary areas?
You said Buehler's not a sure thing.
Yeah, I don't know that he's an ace still. I think he's. I don't know what he is because he's coming off a second Tommy John, and we were kind of concerned. Mason Miller's not a sure thing, obviously, either. We don't even know he's the closer. It's whatever. I mean, I think ultimately it's your decision. But as the one who often underdoes it with saves in these deeper leagues, I'm telling you, I would be concerned that you're going to underdo it in saves in this scenario.
It might happen. Maybe I'm just drinking the Kool-Aid with these recent reports with Walker Buehler hitting 97 miles per hour. They're saying he looks good. I would take the shot on Walker Buehler and I would make the trade. But
okay, I mean,
I like. It's not that I don't.
There's a lot. Is the fact he's hitting 97 miles per hour that meaningful to you? Like, I understand it's a problem if he's hitting 93, but okay, so he's throwing as hard as he's supposed to be throwing, but he was before he got. I don't know. There's a lot more to it than that, obviously.
I mean, I'd rather him be hitting 97 miles per hour than not hitting 97.
Sure. I'll just say I think part of it is
I just never really doubted he was going to hit 97 miles per hour.
I do expect Walker Buehler to be very good. It's not a certainty, but
yeah,
my expectation is once he's able to pitch in games, and I'm expecting that to be something like May. I have fewer performance concerns about Walker Buehler than I do Kodai Senga when they're both able to pitch this season.
Oh, really?
Walker Buehler is starting from a higher point. He was a better pitcher at his best than what we saw from Kodai Senga last year. And
at his best.
He's
not when we last saw him.
But he's also not currently hurt. And that's just that's a much bigger deal than anything else for me, I think.
All right, let's move on. This next one's from Tommy in Long Island. Dear Sparky, Ron, and Roger.
Those are the last 3 Yankees Cy Young winners before Garrett Cole, right?
I think so. That
Sparky, Lyle, and Ron Guidry.
Yes, and the Rocket.
1-1, yeah.
Got Yankees historian over here. Look at that.
Specific to head-to-head point.
Up to confirm, but I was pretty confident.
Yeah. Specific to head-to-head points formats, especially those with daily lineups, can you recommend good bench bats with multi-position eligibility that should be targeted late? Rostering bench pitchers is so important in that format that I find myself wanting to roster one bench bat that can help me in multiple spots. So here are the names that I found going outside the top 200 that have multi-position eligibility. Brandon Drury, Ryan McMahon, Luis Rengifo, Gavin Lux, Brendan Donovan, Jeff McNeil, Willie Castro, Jordan Westberg, Wilmer Flores, and 2 that will gain multi-position eligibility that I think we're all kind of excited about. Michael Busch and Colt Keith.
Colt Keith had his first spring home run today. Love to see that. I like all those guys. I think you left out some pretty obvious ones, though, who might just be too high end to be considered bench guys. But I don't think, like Sal Frelick's a bench guy.
Yeah.
And we don't know when he's going to gain multi-eligibility. He's only outfield eligible right now, but he's played second and third base in the spring. So I do think we'll see him there enough that he'll get there eventually. And then
it sounds like Frelick is going to start at third base, at least against right-handed pitching. So,
and then Jonathan India, who you can get usually around 250 in ADP right now. And I'm starting to come around after having him as a bust early on, because the Reds must have done something to somebody with all the injuries that they've had. I don't know if you guys talked about Edwin Arroyo is now out for the season with shoulder surgery, but that's a big shortstop prospect for them. So that they're down to like one shortstop after having 17 of them at the beginning of spring training. So Jonathan India, I think, is going to play every day as long as he's healthy. He's only second base eligible, but he should play some at first, third, and the outfield.
Well, if Matt McClain's out for a long time, I'm not as confident India's going to play some at first, third, and that. He might just go back to being their second baseman.
Yeah, that's fair.
So I think his overall fantasy value is higher with the news, but he may not become the versatile player we were thinking was, or maybe Spencer Steer plays some second. It just obviously India was their primary second baseman last year. I will add a couple thoughts here. One is that Ha-Sung Kim, he's not a late round pick, but in a points league, he tends to go later. You can probably get him around 10, 11, or 12. And we think of him as primarily a speedster, but he walks a lot too. And stolen base totals are going to be high enough that it's still going to add up to a good number of points. So I actually like to get him for the same reason in points leagues, to kind of for him to be my backup everywhere. Also, Tommy Edman, while he's injured, I imagine he'd be practically free if you have an IL spot to store him in until hopefully he makes it back within a month and a half.
All right.
By the way, Sparky Lyle and Ron Guidry won Cy Youngs in back-to-back years, 1977, 1978. Sparky Lyle should not have won that Cy Young. He threw 137 innings. That was that weird time in the 70s and 80s where everyone just decided that closers were super valuable and needed to win Cy Youngs. And like, we grew up. We grew out of it. All right.
How dare you, Chris? I wasn't expecting Sparky Lyle strays on today's.
I'm
blasphemy.
This is more about the voters at the time. All right.
All right.
I think I said blasphemic earlier, which
you
isn't
did
a
say
word. That was
blasphemic.
weird. I'm sorry about that. It sounded wrong. Blasphemous is the adjective form of blasphemy. Clearly, I am not very smart. Okay, let's keep going.
Let's continue on. This next one's from Ben. I was in the middle of my salary cap draft on Monday when the Blake Snell news broke. The auction platform freaked out and threw everyone out of the draft room. So when I came back and saw him on the board, I sort of panic bought him. A good enough price, but I later realized I didn't have enough money left for Jackson Chourio. Should I now trade Snell for Chourio? I'm not a fan of Snell's volatility, but Chourio is unproven. I know roster context means everything. I'm in an 8-team, 5x5 NL only head-to-head categories. Wow, that was a mouthful. I got Acuna, Tatis, and Lindor, but ultimately had to sacrifice other positions. So Brett Beatty, for example, is my starting third baseman. Woof. For pitching, I also got Dylan Cease, Bobby Miller, Shota Imanaga, and some podcast favorites, Christopher Sanchez and Ryan Weathers. What do you guys think? Snell for Chourio, NL only.
I think it's fine. Like I have them roughly in the same range of the rankings. So I put out my first trade values chart on Wednesday. They're, I would assume, right next to each other or right around. So it's probably fine. It just depends on what you need. I don't think you need pitching. Like Dylan Cease, Bobby Miller, Shota Imanaga. I think that's a solid top 3 for an NL only, even though it's 8 teams. So it, isn't quite as deep. So I think it's fine.
But does he need
think
Chourio with Acuna, Tatis, and Lindor?
Yeah, I don't think I would make the trade.
It feels like a pretty stacked only team, honestly.
Well, you have to remember that it
is only 8 teams. Yeah.
Only 8 teams.
Yeah. That's a tough one. I probably value him about the same at this point, to be honest. And I think, so you're saying you wouldn't do it? You stick with Snell, Chris?
I think so. I also just
these have been tough. The Miller Buehler one, and now this one.
I've got them both as $15 players, both in my salary cap values and my trade values. So which are just
Honestly, I feel the downside risk more for Snell than for Chourio. And that sounds kind of funny to say, I know, because Chorio's a 20-year-old rookie, but that's where I am. And so unless I just, okay, clearly I need pitching more than hitting, I think I would do the deal. I think I'd trade Snell for Chourio.
All right, this next one's from Josh. I am in a 5x5 Dynasty Keeper League with 12 teams, 14 starters on offense, 5 starting pitcher slots, 2 relief pitcher spots, and just 2 general pitcher spots. 23 starters in total. We have 7 bench spots. The draft is deep, and there is not a lot of value to draft closers at all due to it being saves plus holds. It is the strategy of some in the league to semi-punt the saves category or sneak in some late-inning relievers through waivers or late in the draft. Can you tell me a few late-inning guys that have closer potential but will not be closing, or teams that are going the closer by committee route? Brian Abreu from the Astros gave me a lot of hidden value last year. Any other suggestions? Looking for lots of Ks and holds. So okay. I think any of the Brewers, Phillies, and Twins teams right now kind of look like closer by committees. You know, some people might think Jose Alvarado. Obviously, he could emerge, and someone could emerge on any of those teams. But those kind of feel up in the air right now. And then some other names with good ratios, I think, that will provide holds: Hunter Harvey, Jason Adam, Ryan Presley, the aforementioned Brian Abreu, Aroldis Chapman,
Hector Neris.
Yep,
Hector Neris
might end up being the Cubs closer.
Robert Stevenson, whenever he gets healthy. Aroldis Chapman. Did you mention him?
Yep.
Yuki Matsui, Jason Adam. I know you mentioned him. Matt Brash. He's currently hurt, but eventually, Yennier Cano. Yeah. You know, I think Kimbrel's going to be fine closing, but Yennier Cano would be the backup guy and the clear 8th inning guy. Bruce Dark Gratterall, who I also think is banged up. Man, a lot of hurt setup in right now.
AJ Minter has been a really good saves plus holds guy. I don't know if anybody mentioned him.
And targeting good relievers on good teams makes sense in this.
Yes.
And I think has a chance to end up the Marlins closer if Tanner Scott falters.
Well, I mean, I don't know that his ratio is going to be amazing, but Adam Ottavino setting up for Edwin Diaz. You know what? I actually, just on Thursday, I did a bullpen breakdown for all 30 teams.
Yes, you did.
I listed the top 3 or 4 save candidates in order and some other information in there. So that would be a good resource to answer this question.
Last name that I'll mention there is David Robertson. Even if he's not the closer, I think the Rangers will win a lot of games, and he should be the setup man behind Jose Leclerc. This next one's from Lou. I'm in a 12-team 5x5 league, has been together 37 years, and it's really competitive. We protect 10 players, wrestling with my last protect, or I guess keeper, between Tanner Scott and Spencer Steer. Both are $5. Our league has 23 closers likely being protected, and the only real closers that will be available are Jordan Romano, who's hurt, and Emmanuel Clase, who's not hurt. I feel in our league will be tough to get a legit closer, but can put together a final roster spot and reserve picks of some lower closers and setup men. It's such a volatile position. I love having Steer, who qualifies at 4 different positions.
Oh,
so that's a first, second, third, and outfield, I guess. It's probably a Yahoo league.
One of the fancy leagues where you get Steer at second base.
I have Steer valued much more highly than
Tanner Scott.
We're talking Tanner Scott. Yeah, I think Tanner Scott's an $8 player. Steer's like a $14 player for me, something like that. So even with the context of your league, I think I'd rather go with Steer. But I get it if you want to go with Scott. I don't know. I don't feel particularly confident in Tanner Scott at this point. Even though I have him as an $8 player, I'm not even sure I would like. There have definitely been drafts where I have just not bid on Tanner Scott, even at that price.
Yeah, so this is like probably a difference of about comparing this to the Walker Buehler, Mason Miller situation from earlier.
Yeah,
there's probably about 150 fewer players being rostered overall in this league, it being a 12-teamer. And so I think you can have a little more faith that you're going to be able to supplement your saves over the course of the season. And so I would definitely prefer to have Spencer Steer to Tanner Scott myself.
This one's from TJ. Hello there, Ryan, Jimmy, and Chase.
Oh, that's
the Phillies, baby.
Yeah, Phillies, World
Ryan
Series.
Howard, Jimmy Rollins, and Chase Elly. I have a question related to head-to-head leagues with IL spots and playoffs. Is there any value in drafting multiple currently injured players at lower values to make a strong push for a playoff run? The recent news of Garrett Cole and Gavin Williams gives some obvious examples, but can you provide a top 5 or top 10 list of less obvious players that would meet this criteria? I'm mostly thinking in the lens of a keeper/auction league where I have a strong core of players I'm confident can get me to the playoffs, but would like to make a stronger push in the playoffs.
There are a lot of injured players right now.
Yeah, you have not done an IL stash piece yet.
No,
Are you
I
planning on
haven't.
it?
Before opening day, I'm not sure that's going to happen. Probably soon after opening day, but
I'll do it. I'll do it next week.
I'll
Don't worry
do it.
about it.
Say I won't.
I'm looking for ideas.
Okay. That's fine. Let's see. A lot of pitchers. So I would put Nick Lodolo. He's probably not even going to be out for long.
Yeah, I think April 10th is his expected debut.
But I love the upside there still, particularly for strikeouts. Obviously, Kodai Senga. I guess you didn't mention him here. He's the one I'm probably most invested in. He's one of 3 players who I've rostered in 5 leagues, Kodai Senga.
Justin Verlander.
Yep.
Probably not going to be all that long for him. Sonny Gray is probably not going to be all that long, but he's been discounted. Walker Buehler, like we talked about earlier.
So Shane Baz is Walker Buehler you mentioned. Yeah. Shane Baz is going to be probably out long enough that there's a chance you could get him for really cheap, but I expect him to make an impact, potentially a high impact at some point. Kyle Bradish, I think, belongs in this discussion, even though his situation is murkier with the UCL damage to his elbow.
All indications are he's progressing well. Taj Bradley also likely to start on the IL, but
Max Scherzer.
Yes.
Max Scherzer, Alex Cobb, Robbie Ray. I mean,
oh yeah, Scherzer's a great one. Yeah.
Cobb not as a high end of a pitcher. Robbie Ray, it's tough because we haven't seen him pitch in so long. And I feel like for him, maybe there could be a little bit more, control issues coming back.
Isn't there talk of Jeffrey Springs returning mid-season?
Yeah, I think June or July is possible.
Yeah, Drew Rasmussen, Jacob deGrom as well could all be back before the end of the season. I think you have to stash those guys a little lower. Yohan Duran.
Yeah, relievers. Jordan Romano probably going to start on the IL.
Devin Williams would.
Yeah.
Though, did he mention that one? He said Williams. I guess he was talking about Gavin Williams.
Yeah.
All right. I think we've covered it.
Yeah.
This next one is from Yehuda. My 12-team league has a $7 add-on each year. You keep somebody. $310 budget. I was offered an $8 Jackson Holiday and $8 Mitch Keller for $17 Zach Gallen. I already have George Kirby and Framber Valdez for $41 combined. Should I take the deal and gamble on having Jackson Holiday for $15 next year?
I mean, yeah, because you think about like $310 budget. Most of the extra $50 should go to high-end players. That's personally speaking. You're still going to have plenty of $3 and $4 players in this league. So that means like Jackson Holiday might be keepable for like 3 or 4 more years if he lives up to his potential, even with a pretty robust $7 increase. So I think the drop off from Zach Gallen to Mitch Keller is significant, obviously, but might be small enough that it's just outright a win without even considering the values here.
You take away just 2 of Mitch Keller's crooked 8-run starts last year, and his numbers look a lot like Zach Gallen's. I'm just saying.
Oh my God.
It's true.
Yes.
Take away Zach Gallen's 2 worst starts while you're at it.
Yeah, let's do that.
Well, they're not machines, Chris. You can't like.
You can only do it for Mitch Keller. He's the only one.
He's the only one. Let's go Pirates. You weren't on the other day, Chris. We are officially
you guys are
Pirates
laughing,
podcast.
but it's like people dismiss this. It's not.
I'm not dismissing it.
People
I just
can have a bad day, and it doesn't mean they're
agree.
going to have that exact same bad day the next year.
I agree, but I just
Okay.
don't think you can apply that standard to only one player.
I agree.
I think
mean,
it's
that's-
fine.
That's
to take-
fine.
I think it's fine to take everyone's 2 worst starts away. I don't think you can just do it for one guy.
but it's not going to happen. Like, you don't know who it's going to happen to is the thing. So you like, yes, you could do You could do that and say this is Zach Gallen's upside. Remove his worst 2 starts. That's his upside. Yes, that's fine. But nobody's
I don't think
nobody's doubting the upside of
You
Zach
can't
Gallen.
just take Mitch Keller's 2 starts and say he was basically Zach Gallen.
I'm
and
saying
like
if
that's
those
where it's
2
unfair.
starts don't happen though.
If you eliminate 16 earned runs, Chris,
Yeah, I mean, like that's
a lot of earned runs, you know?
No, I get the point you're making. I'm just saying applying it inconsistently is unfair.
If that's what I'm doing, but I don't know. I don't think we're going to be able to close this gap within a reasonable time frame. So we should probably just keep going.
Mitch Keller is a pitcher that's more likely to get blown up than other pitchers, just because he doesn't miss bats as much, like a 9.7% swinging strike rate. But anyway, whatever. We've talked enough about Mitch Keller. Let's take our final break. When we return, we've got a special guest joining us. We'll do that right after this.
Last dance. I shall follow your lead.
We're on a search for one of the greatest powers ever known. Let's fly.
Welcome back in. Our buddies over at the Fantasy Football Today podcast have their annual draft-a-thon every September to help raise money for St. Jude Children's Hospital. And last year, they auctioned off a few guest appearances on this podcast. And with that, please welcome to the show, Frank.
Thank you. It's awesome to be here, guys. Thanks.
Yeah, for those watching, you see the name down there, ADP Frank. I'm Roto Frank. He's ADP Frank.
Perfect.
And here we are. Great name. Welcome, and thanks so much, obviously, for donating to a great cause. Let's just get in, because you sent us over a bunch of different topics that you wanted to get to. It's kind of a fantasy smorgasbord that we have coming up here, with a bit of a focus on daily head-to-head points leagues. And this is not something that we talk about often, so I think it's a good opportunity. It sounds like it's something that you have a level of expertise in. So start us off with some kind of draft strategies that you use in a daily head-to-head points format.
Okay, so right off the bat, I would say you don't draft a catcher. You would totally eliminate catcher completely, simply due to the fact that, yes, there are very few catchers that are going to get huge plate appearances, get a lot of volume, but outside of those picks, the level of replacement value is quite negligible, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. So like the 18th best catcher and the 22nd best catcher, probably not much difference there. And getting a top catcher in the 3rd round might be fantastic. However, I think the value of getting a 3rd round Semien or 3rd round Schwarber is much more valuable, especially in a points league, than relying on a catcher that, for the most part, catchers don't even play every day. So you're already taking a hit there.
And I assume that's a one catcher league, right, Frank?
Correct.
Yeah, and Chris, this is something we talked about when we were doing our analysis of Adley Rutschman, is that, you know, it's nothing against Adley Rutschman, but if he's going in the 3rd or 4th round, the fact that you can get, you know, a Bo Naylor with one of your last picks, or a Mitch Garver or someone like that, it's just the difference in draft cost, the opportunity cost of taking an Adley Rutschman that early.
The thing with Adley Rutschman specifically is, like, points is his better format, arguably. And he plays pretty much every day. He had like 670 plate appearances last year. And given that context, his point total last year was pretty underwhelming. Like
exactly.
Did he even get to like 450 in CBS standard scoring? Scott, I don't know if you have that data in front of you. But yeah, that's the thing that always stands out when I look at Adley Rutschman. Okay, so that's...
And how much did William Contreras put up?
428.
Yeah.
So what is the difference there? Right? Like
1 point a week.
They actually average the same fantasy points per game. 3
fantasy. And where is the difference in draft right now? Are they apart by a big difference?
I think it's probably 2 to 3 rounds, right?
Yeah.
I think in most drafts. Yeah.
That's pretty, and the difference was like 1 point a week.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. Yeah. So there's no value there.
Right. It would have to be a discount. But how many hitters are you starting? Because you're just starting one catcher. How many hitters total?
So there would be the classic 1st, 2nd, 3rd, short, a middle, a corner, and 5 outfielders.
Okay, so pretty big lineup overall.
Yeah, with one utility.
Because, you know, obviously catchers are going to score less than any other hitter.
Exactly.
They're not getting as much playing time. But there is an element of how much is your catcher scoring relative to the other catcher?
Yeah.
Like that.
I guess the only argument that could be made is Perez actually has first base eligibility. Mm-hmm. So if you were able to somehow wait on Perez and Contreras, for example, and have that, you could have him in your first, and you could have a catcher, and you can actually switch them in and out.
Well, that would not be great, just because the relative value.
Yeah, you're losing the first catcher.
Exactly. Yeah, so I don't see the value. Yeah.
And look,
I guess the only option would have been Varsho, maybe.
I like the upside of so many catchers that I don't want to invest highly in that position either. But just as a matter of principle, I think if at a discount you can get a catcher that separates you, that sets you apart from every other team's catcher, it is worth it. There is a point where it's worth it. It's not round 3. Like
that's saying. That's why I like Mitch Garver, who just does not seem to get drafted as if he might play 140 games, even though he very well may.
He might be benefited by the DH in Seattle. So,
Frank, talk to me about how you address pitching in this format. I think a lot of people who play in a daily head-to-head points format, they're probably looking to stream pitching often. Do you find yourself waiting on pitchers and then just jumping in and grabbing as many of those like mid-tier options as possible and just kind of playing the matchups? How do you attack pitching in a daily points league?
I would say precisely what you said in terms of trying to attack the mid rounds, like rounds 6 through 12 in the draft, to try to get as many of the non-glob kind of pitchers that are able to stand out. But that being said, I think waiver wires are not as useful in a daily league because the transactions only occur on a weekly basis. Mm-hmm. So it's more advantageous to kind of have your set guys that you believe in and ride them out throughout the year rather than constantly like trying to be like, who's the spot starter this week?
Yeah. And that's an important distinction to make specifically with weekly versus daily transactions. Yes. So you're talking about a league where your waiver runs once a week. You have one opportunity to pick players up, but then you can change as much as you want. So in a typical daily league where daily roster moves are allowed, that's where you see a lot of that free for all. And that's where you see like, hey, the Rockies are on the road, I'm going to stream Kyle Freeland, where in this league, you actually have to use a whole roster spot the whole week on Kyle Freeland if you want to stream him. So that's where it gets a little more difficult. I do want to point out Kyle Freeland's velocity is up like 3 miles per hour this spring.
No,
it is.
And I think he opens the season with 2 road starts.
He does.
I'm gonna give Nick Pollock a hat tip on this one. Early season streamer Kyle Freeland. Just saying.
I think they're in Arizona to start the year.
Yeah, at Arizona, and then it's a decent matchup. The second one.
Another interesting point. Sorry to cut you off there, Chris.
Go.
In terms of starting pitchers, last year of the top 30 that were drafted, only 14 of them made more than 25 starts.
Yeah.
So 16 of them didn't. So right off the bat, that's a coin flip.
Yeah.
Right. So if I'm thinking like out of every 10 pitchers I draft, possibly half of them are not even going to return value. You have to rely so much more heavily on the volume in pitching in a daily league, which also then eliminates relief pitching completely.
Yeah, and I really do like that aspect of your league. And I would recommend, look, I'm not going to tell people how to play, but I think if you play in a daily lineup league, specifically in a points league, the weekly transactions is probably the way to go. Because then, like, if you do the daily ads, like, things just get out of control and people. You can put. I think you can
players don't really have value in that. Like, it's like the top 140 players matter, and everyone else is kind of expendable.
Yeah,
it really becomes a competition in who has the most time to attend to their team, which is something we've harped on before. But we do get those emails like, how do you keep people from streaming a zillion pitchers every day? Well, there are 2 ways to do that. If you're going to have a daily lineup league, there are 2 ways to do that. One is to run waivers weekly, like you do, ADP Frank, or the other is to limit the number of transactions each week to set that upper limit on that.
Frank, talk to me about your typical draft breakdown. You mentioned earlier you don't like to take catchers early on, but what are you typically looking to do early on? I mean, I guess based on our conversation is you like to probably take hitters and then you draft pitchers in the mid rounds. But
so looking at the first, if I could break down the first 5 rounds, I would say it is entirely critical for you to return on top 50 player value of those 5 picks, right? I don't think you can really, it would be incredibly more challenging to win a league if your first, 2 or 3 of your top 5 picks actually bust. You would need to really catch on a Mitch Keller like last year, or
that's right.
Eflin. You would need to catch on somebody in the late 20 rounds to make up for that mix in the front round. So for example, this year, I would say, let's say you had the 6th pick. That's pretty average. Like you're right in the middle. I would say in the first round, you probably would like to go Soto if available. If not available, possibly Tucker. And then if not available, possibly Ohtani. Obviously, that does put in your utility spot and it locks you in. However, I would say like this time last year, we were drafting Ohtani, as a top number 1 player in a daily league. I know he's not pitching this year, but let's be honest, he's going to play every day. Yeah. So, I mean, second round, I would say that would be your only opportunity to kind of shift towards pitching, and possibly Burns. I think Burns will have possibly the greatest availability to return on investment. And when looking at starting pitching, quality starts is a lot more of an important variable in a points league because you get extra points there versus looking at wins, hypothetically, because you can't predict wins. So quality starts, Burns has led quality starts in the last 3 years. So, I mean, he's a great indicator of hopefully getting 20 quality starts would be a high level there. Third round, I would say you want to go second base. You want to go Semien or Altuve. You want to load up second base. Obviously, you guys know I'm preaching to the choir, but there was only 3 second basemen. Obviously, we're not including Betts because he wasn't second base. There was only 3 guys last year that hit 25 home runs and stole 20 bases, got close to 100 RBIs or 100 runs, and it's the same guys. It's Altuve, Albies, and Semien. And I think in a points league, Semien makes the most sense because of the volume play. He's going to get 700 plate appearances. I doubt Altuve or Albies will. So I would go Semien there, third round. Fourth round, I would go Bregman and take your advantage at third base. Great in a points league. He is going to get more walks than strikeouts. So that is at a third base. I think outside of Bregman, Ramirez is the only other option, and you're unable to take him if you go Soto or Tucker. So Bregman, I would assume. And if for some reason Bregman doesn't work, Max Muncy, 10th round, is a fantastic value. And there's no doubt about that.
Now, if you're drafting with me, Bregman's probably going to go in round 3, and then Muncy's probably going to go in round 8. That's exactly what I do in the points leagues too. So many of the third basemen are just not well suited for that format.
They're not, yeah.
And if you could get Jose Ramirez, that's one thing. But you have to commit at a certain point. So yeah, my plan going in is usually Alex Bregman in round 3 or Muncy in round 8.
There you go. So, and then fifth, shortstop, I would go with Cruz this year. I think he is your greatest value on a top 50 player, possibly being a top 5 player. If we talked next year at the same time and said Cruz finished as a number 5th player in the league, I mean, it's not impossible. So I think at a value point of view, there is the most amount of return on that investment in the 5th round.
Hey, man, like you said, preaching to the choir. I drafted him in our head-to-head league the other day at the end of the 5th round, and I was happy to do it. My first share of O'Neal Cruz. So, yes, please, let's make that happen. Monster year here, hopefully coming for O'Neal Cruz. Frank, you broke down the early rounds, what you like to do. In the mid-rounds, you like to target some of those volume starting pitchers. What about later on? What about some late-round sleepers that you like to target this year?
Okay, so late round. So if we're going pitching, I would say – outside of ADP 200 is Carlos Rodon. I think Carlos Rodon has a huge bounce back potential. If we look at the last 3 years, he finished as a top 3 starting pitcher 2 out of those 3 years. And last year, obviously, injuries. So I think Rodon is a great buy low. So you don't have to take him as your 20th pick, but maybe if you take him as a 15th or 14th round pick, great value there with the upside. Lance Lynn at 312 ADP. Where is there a pitcher in the 300s that's going to give you 200 strikeouts?
Yeah, I mean, in a points league, especially like in a roto league, it's Lynn might not be worth the roster spot because the ratios might be so bad. But in a points league where that matters less, he's going to give you volume.
Exactly. And speaking of volume, let's talk about Kyle Gibson. Of the last 3 years, the most innings pitched by any pitcher is Corbin Burns, Garrett Cole, and last but not least, Kyle Gibson.
Really third?
He's third in innings pitched over the last 3 years.
I honestly...
Many people don't even think about that.
You could have given me 40 guesses,
Yeah.
and I don't think I would have gotten there.
Another big thing people don't think about is Gibson put up 17 quality starts last year. And Burns put up, I believe, 20. So obviously there's not there's a small difference there. But if you're looking for value late, I think that's a big one.
Do you want to guess where Kyle Gibson ranked in head-to-head points, just total points among starting pitchers last year in CBS standard scoring?
I have no clue. Where did he
I have no idea.
No idea.
No,
he was top 30. He was top 30. I'd have to count it all the way out, but he was like 28, 29.
And where are you drafting him?
Not at all, probably.
Right.
He did win 15 games. Yeah. His per start, his per start score was pretty average.
Okay, but if you look at, for example, Garrett Cole's stats, and you look at Kyle Gibson's stats, Kyle Gibson is 75% of Garrett Cole's stats. They had the same amount of wins. Garrett Cole had about 67 more strikeouts, and obviously the ERA and WHIP are different, but we are talking about a difference of a first-round value and a guy that's not getting drafted.
My point is just, one, I don't think you can count on Kyle Gibson winning 15 again.
That's fair.
Two, because he made all his starts, it added up to more points. But when pitchers miss starts, obviously you get a replacement in his place. So it's not an apples to apples comparison. But the point you're making, I think, is you look at that 4.73 ERA for Kyle Gibson last year, and you probably think he's without value. In a points league, not necessarily. That ERA doesn't have there's not a direct consequence to that ERA. Obviously, the runs count against him, but if he's pitching enough innings to counteract it, then he still has value.
And he's third in innings over the last few years, so I feel like that is a good value for where he's going.
Yeah, that volume just matters so much more in a points league. And I think Kyle Gibson actually got taken in our 12-team listener league the other day. It's a points league. You know, there were some kind of just like boring pitchers like Taijuan Walker, but those guys are going to give you innings and they're going to be in a position to win games on good teams. Frank, you can continue on with some pitchers, or if you have
I just wanted to throw in Trevor Rogers, Miami. He's an interesting guy. And at one point, I find myself sometimes trying to look in a little deeper at the social aspect of a player. So, for example, Trevor Rogers, a lot of people don't realize this, but when COVID was happening, both his grandparents died. And at the same week, both his parents got COVID. And he was actually fearful for his dad losing his life. And it totally screwed up his season. And looking back on it, he never even recovered 2 years after that. This year going into it, he said he has a clear head. He said mentally he's feeling a lot better. I think there's a big bounce back here for a guy that's a big thrower and somebody that's hitting 96.
Chris, I was at Rates and Barrels. They recorded a live podcast yesterday. I was there, and Saris and Nick Pollock were talking up all the Marlins starters really, but Trevor Rogers was someone who has not really gotten the hype that Ryan Weathers and AJ Puck have, but he's having a very good spring himself. The stuff looks back, and I think Rogers is absolutely a late round target.
Yeah, and he's mentally there, which is a big. Sometimes I think we forget that these people are humans.
Absolutely,
and they're not just robots. They just go out and do stuff. And when things are happening in their personal life, I think that does have a big impact on them. Giolito's a great example last year, going through a divorce, getting traded. People don't think about those things, but those things have a big impact. And sometimes it can help understand the numbers.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great point. Frank, were there any late round hitters that you want to
Okay, quickly. Outfield. Brandon Nimmo. He's obviously not a 30th round guy, but he's not a 5th round guy either. And he's going to bring back, in a points league, especially with the walks, with the volume of hitting leadoff, he's going to bring back high value for a guy that's going in the 14th or 12th round. Very similar to a Rodon of sorts. Second base, Whit Merrifield. He is a great option, not only at second base, but at outfield. He has both. And he's obviously going to be playing. I think last year in Toronto, we saw a little bit of his stolen base abilities that we kind of forgot about. And this year, I think in Philly, I think he'll actually be pushed a little harder than the Jays actually used him. And on top of that, Brandon Drury. Brandon Drury is a great guy because he has first and second eligibility, which actually then goes corner and middle. And that's a big addition in the daily league. When guys are sitting or guys aren't playing, if you can put Brandon Drury not only at second, not only at first, but at corner and at middle, that's a big help.
Yeah, and we had a question early on in the podcast asking about this exact thing, and I was like, maybe we should just call Frank on now, let him talk about this.
Yeah.
They were asking about multi-position eligibility for hitters in daily points leagues, and I think that makes a lot of sense to have at least one of them on your team just so you can kind of move things around.
You definitely need at least one or two because injuries are going to happen. And on top of that, there just isn't. I think in previous years there were a lot more guys that had multiple eligibilities, but this year there's less. I think you guys spoke about it earlier today, like Sal Frelick. Will he get second base and third base? If he does, that's a huge addition to being an outfielder.
Yep.
And you know we'll see. Ryan McMahon is a big one. The only downside with Ryan McMahon is that he's literally a daily player that's only half because you can only really play him when he's at home. His splits are horrible.
Something I brought up before too in a points league, and I learned this the hard way: do not have multiple Rockies in a head-to-head points league because if you can't play them when they're on the road,
exactly.
or you don't want to. I mean, if you play in a deeper points league and you somehow wind up with Nolan Jones and Ryan McMahon on your team, I mean, when they're both on the road,
you're done.
Rough, man. So
right.
I don't for what it's worth. I don't think Ryan McMahon. You. It sounds like Frank, your head-to-head points league is deeper than most because you have the middle infield spot, you have the corner infield spot, you have 5 outfielders. So that's different from the CBS standard. But I don't think Ryan McMahon's going to make the cut in most of those formats just because his skill set isn't optimized for it.
Okay.
Discipline, especially. I feel like Nolan Jones is the only Rocky. Maybe Chris Bryant.
What about Tovar
in the points league? Yeah, I mean, same thing. He just doesn't have plate discipline for.
Yeah.
Maybe in your league because you have the extra middle infield spot to fill, he gets drafted. But I think
he just needs to get better. You know, that's the kind of thing with him where. Right. You know, he's got to take a step forward to really even be worth using in a 12-team roto, let alone standard points.
The hope is he becomes a Trevor Story of Colorado.
Yeah, that would be the very high-end outcome for Ezekiel Tovar. Let's wrap up with this, Frank. I think this is a good way to just kind of bring everything home. We all love fantasy baseball, right? That's why we play. That's why we do the podcast here. Why do you love fantasy baseball? Because this is a question that you gave to us and you wanted to answer. So why do you love it?
Okay, so I love fantasy baseball because I find that it is the most intriguing fantasy aspect to creating a team. I like the fact that there's so many positions and there's so much variability in terms of the team. No two fantasy teams are really alike in baseball. There's so much ability to craft a winner in different ways. That, along with I think this might be the teacher in me, but it really teaches critical thinking and problem solving and understanding that there are many different ways to get to a solution and there's not just one way. And I think within the draft, you kind of realize that when you actually go backwards and kind of figure out, hey, if I can take Jonathan India here, then that means I don't need to maybe necessarily pull on a second baseman in round 1 or 2 or whatever it happens to be. So I think, overall, I think we all just love fantasy baseball. And for me, it's the most exciting.
And I think something else that's unique to fantasy baseball, just compared to the other fantasy sports, is how different the formats are, right? And
yes,
constantly trying to talk about the differences between roto and head-to-head categories and head-to-head points and just address the different formats. And there are so many different ways to win and build teams in different formats. I don't know that you can, like fantasy football is, and nothing against it, it's pretty straightforward, right? It's like, it's PPR, it's not PPR.
Right.
Like you want to score touchdowns, you want catches, right? Like pretty straightforward.
So many different ways to play fantasy baseball. And that's a point I brought up too, ADP Frank, about the variety of positions in baseball relative to football. Football is basically just, to a certain degree, it's just wide receivers and running backs, right?
Exactly.
At some point, you got to mix in your quarterback. At some point, you got to mix in your tight end. But that's basically it. And so there are only so many paths you can take there. But in baseball, there's so much more game planning and personalizing you can do
and
for your roster.
We talk about one of the pieces we would do for football every year is this like pick by pick series where if you're picking first, here's what your team's going to look like. And we've talked about doing something like that for baseball, but it's like
there's so much.
You can only really do that for the first like 3 rounds. And then it's like, if you take Elly De La Cruz in the 2nd round in the 6th spot or the 12th spot, your team is going to look drastically different than anyone else's who picks from that spot. And so it's definitely there's a lot less homogeneity in the way you build teams in baseball than football for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. He is ADP Frank. We appreciate everything that you brought to the table here today.
Thank you guys so much. It's been a great time.
Yeah, obviously for donating to a great cause. So thank you for joining us.
Absolutely.
We appreciate it, man. Yep.
No problem.
We're going to wrap there for the Franks. Scott, Chris, thanks as always for tuning in to Fantasy Baseball today. Please make sure to follow and leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. And we will be back again next week. Bye-bye.